A few episodes ago, I gave you a brief history of Islam, a religion that about 20% of the world's population adheres to. Today, we're going to be continuing it. I'm going to talk about what the Quran says about women, the differences between Sunnis and Shiites, and the rise of radicalism. I know you've been waiting for part 2, and here it is. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Welcome to the show where I talk about timeless, eternal, enduring subjects. Today we are going to be doing a part 2 of an episode I did a few episodes ago on Islam. The title of that episode is called Islam 101. So this one will probably be called Islam 101 Part 2. Inventive, I know. First, please subscribe to this channel. Follow me at Julie R. Hartman. And also, I'm doing this survey. You guys have heard it before. I've talked about it. I'd love to hear what you think of the show. The link is in the description down below. Before we dive in, I just want to tell you something that I'm feeling so much right now, and I just feel like I have to burst and say it. I love learning. I'm being dead serious. I love learning. I think this stuff is so cool. You know, Sean's like cracking up, my producer. He's like a nerd. You know, guys love to sit and talk about the Warriors and the Lakers and sports, bro. And women like talking about shoes and jewelry. I love talking about Islam, okay? Call me crazy. I'm a nerd. He's cracking up. I am a nerd. I think this stuff is so cool. The world is fascinating. There is this religion that 20% of people adhere to. It is so complicated, so nuanced. I mean, it's awesome. Who doesn't want to learn about this? By the way, if there's any subject that you think that I should do, tell me. Do it in the survey. Tell me whatever you want me to talk about on the show. I talk about owls. I talk about music. I talk about hookup culture as recently as the other day. I want to cover all of the nuances and fun things about the world because learning is cool. How about that? All right, let's move on. As I said in that first episode of Islam 101, I gave some basic background information. I'm going to spend about 2 minutes right now just giving you a little bit of a repeat on that because this is really important in order to understand the subsequent issues that I'm going to talk about. First, this month marks the month of Ramadan, which is Islam's holy month of fasting, where believers have to fast, no food, no water, from sunrise to sunset. They are also prohibited from engaging in other impure things such as swearing, arguing, gossiping, and sexual contact. This is in order to demonstrate control, restraint, purify one's body, become closer to God, and also remind believers of the plight of others, those who go without food and water on a daily basis, not just during a holy holiday. So this month of Ramadan commenced on Wednesday, March 22nd, 2023, and it is going until Thursday, April 20th, and it ends in the celebration of Eid, which is where Muslims break the fast. Ramadan, by the way, marks the month where it is believed that the Prophet Muhammad was visited by an angel, and the angel revealed the Quran, or the holy text, to Muhammad. Speaking of the Quran is sort of the equivalent of the Muslim Bible. It was revealed, allegedly, to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century in Arabia by an angel. And what's really important to understand about the Quran is that unlike the other Abrahamic monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity, the Quran is not a third testament. In other words, it doesn't build upon, or it's not an addition to, the OT and the New T, as I call them. The New Testament, the Christian Bible, is a supplement to the Old Testament. It adds on. The Quran does not. The Quran replaces the Old Testament and New Testament. Muslims hold that Christians and Jews sort of got it wrong. The Quran recognizes the presence of prophets that preceded the Prophet Muhammad, such as Moses, David, and even Jesus, but says that Muhammad is the final prophet of humanity and that the Quran is the perfect, accurate, complete version of the previous monotheistic texts. Arabic is the language of the Quran. It is considered to be a holy language, and only when the Quran is written in Arabic is it really considered to be a true Quran. A mosque is equivalent to the Muslim church. There's no poetry, no music, no statues allowed. It is seen as adulterous inside the mosque. Also, there are no depictions allowed, period, not just inside the mosque, but outside the mosque, of the Prophet Muhammad. The Danish learned this lesson back in 2006 when a Danish newspaper printed some images of the Prophet Muhammad, and they were trying to do it in a satirical way. They were depicting, one of them had the Prophet Muhammad and his head was a bomb, of course, to talk about radical Islamic terror. And the Danish flag was actually the most burned flag that year in 2006 because the Muslim world was very offended. The Danish embassy in Damascus was burned down. That's just to say, no depictions of the Prophet, no poetry, music, sculpture allowed in the mosque. They want it to be austere. That is seen as more ritually pure. But calligraphy, of course, in Arabic with Quranic verses is allowed, and that's why you see on mosques such as the Dome of the Rock, beautiful, beautiful writings of calligraphy. They've really made language in that as their kind of art. The mosque service, if you will, is led by an imam, which is equivalent to a Muslim priest, and believers pray side by side in the direction of Mecca, which of course is where Islam was founded in Saudi Arabia. You have to take off your shoes in the mosque. It is seen as more ritually pure, and no non-Muslims are allowed in a mosque during prayer time. Finally, again, this is just a repeat of last week, 5 pillars of Islam. I like to say there are 2 P's, 2 C's, and an F. Pilgrimage prayer, charity, creed, and fasting. You see, I looked right at the camera. I didn't even look at my notes for that one because I just have it in my brain. So fasting is with regard to the month of Ramadan, which is this month. Prayer, 5 times a day in the direction of Mecca. Pilgrimage is the obligation incumbent on every Muslim who can afford it that must go to the Hijaz, which is the holy sites of Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. Charity is to give money or an alms task to give to, which is distributed to other Muslims who are poor. And finally, the creed is, and I'm going to look right at the camera and tell it to you because I don't need my notes. I testify that there is no prophet. Nope, that's not it. I testify that there is no other God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is the creed, and hello, I am right. I'm just bragging at this point. That's what this whole episode has turned into. Just kidding. In order to really understand Islam, it's really important to compare it to the other monotheistic religions. Islam is like Judaism in the sense that they place a premium on prohibited foods, especially pigs. And Islam is actually a lot like Christianity in some ways in that, A, it's a proselytizing religion, unlike Judaism and Hinduism. Christianity and Islam like to bring their message and indeed view it as a responsibility to bring their faith to others. And also, Christianity and Islam believe in heaven and hell, and that believers are only the ones that are admitted to heaven. But of course, there are significant differences between the two religions, and really here with the differences is where you start to understand Islam the best. Muslims reject the fatherhood of God as blasphemy. They think that the Christian concept of the Holy Trinity is polytheistic. That's why on the Dome of the Rock, there's a Quranic verse that says, "He is God, one eternal, he does not beget, nor is he begotten." The fact that Muslims built the Dome of the Rock in the center, of Jerusalem, which is, for a very long time at that point was a Christian site, was sort of a message to Christians: we do not agree with your religion. Also, of the 10 commandments, which is both the basis of Judaism and Christianity, 3 of the commandments are concerned with one's duty to God. 7 are concerned with one's duty to fellow humans. This is different in Islam. Of the 5 pillars of the Muslim faith, 4 are connected to one's relationship and duty with God, and only 1, the charity pillar, is connected with one's a duty to one's fellow man. So this shows that Islam places a huge sense of importance on one's relationship with God, and this explains why there are no secular governments in the Muslim Middle East, and again why sort of more of the tenets of the Muslim faith, which I'm going to get to more in just one moment. But first, it's so important in order to understand Islam to understand the differences between Sunnis and Shias. This explains not just Islam, but relations between countries that we see today. People compare the divide between Sunnis and Shias as similar to the Christian divide between Protestants and Catholics, but it is actually much more cemented between Sunnis and Shias than Protestants and Catholics. It originated, and first, so important too, Sunnis comprise 90% of Muslims, Shias only comprise 10%. Iran is one of the only Middle Eastern countries, Muslim countries, that is Shia. Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who led Iraq for many years until the United States disposed him, he was Sunni, but he led a Shia majority. The majority of Iraq was and continues to be Shia, and now in the wake of Saddam Hussein's ousting, it is led by Shias. Indeed, it is a satellite state of Iran. So that's just to say most are Sunnis. And the divide between them actually started back in the 7th century when the Prophet Muhammad died. And there was a succession crisis. And Sunnis traced the successor of the Prophet Muhammad to a man named Abu Bakr. That is who was supposed to be the successor and the next caliph. A caliphate is sort of really an equivalent is like a kingdom, or it's headed by a king, and the entire Muslim world is supposed to be united under one caliphate, not divided into countries if you are following the proper way of understanding the Quran. So Sunnis anointed this guy Abu Bakr, who ended up indeed being the caliph because Sunnis far outnumbered Shias. But the Shias said that the proper caliph, the proper successor to the Prophet Muhammad, was Ali. Ali was the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, and Ali married Fatima, who is the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad had no sons. So when you hear about the Fatimid Caliphate or the Fatimid dynasty, that's associated with Shias. But the other caliphs come from Abu Bakr, and that is according to Sunni view of Islam. That was the origin of the divide. But as, of course, the years have gone on, there have been more divides between Sunnis and Shias, namely that Shias still claim the right to interpret the Quran and attribute certain sayings to the Prophet Muhammad. The way that the Islamic world works is sort of threefold, and it obviously traces to the Quran. The Quran is not just a religious text, but it is a governmental text. It deals with matters pertaining to, of course, religious law, but also what we in the West would call civil and constitutional law. Then there is Sharia law, which is sort of, if you will, a summary of the laws that are outlined in the Quran. It's just sort of another way of saying Quranic law. And then there are these things called hadiths. Hadiths are sayings that were allegedly attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. After the Prophet Muhammad died, a lot of countries, or a lot of, at that point, and not really countries, but leaders of the Muslim world needed to find answers of questions that were unanswered by the Quran. So what they did is they developed this idea that the Prophet Muhammad, since he was chosen by God to be sort of the carrier of the Quran, that anything that the Prophet Muhammad said was divinely inspired and thus could stand alongside the Quran as a divine rule. But of course, the Prophet Muhammad was dead. So what they did is they developed these hadiths where someone, and it had to be a certain religious authority, and there are all these different protocols of how to corroborate that the Prophet Muhammad said that, but a religious authority would say something and attribute it to the Prophet Muhammad, and it had to be proved, and that hadith would stand alongside the Quran as equal in divinity and equal in authority. So back to Sunnis and Shias. Sunnis, after about 3 centuries, said, enough of this. There are enough hadiths, we have the Quran, we have Sharia law, we're done. No more interpretation. Shias have said that there can still be interpretation of the Quran, there can still be hadiths, and this makes sense because the Shias are a minority, and in order to, sort of, I guess, counteract oppression by Sunnis or increase their stature in the world, it is more advantageous for them, and I say this with respect. I'm not, of course, trying to say that, it's all for utilitarian reasons, but there's more sort of an incentive or a reason for Shias as a minority to need to kind of claim more sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Also, Shias allow things like temporary marriage for 3 years. Sunnis don't. There are all these sort of little differences, but of course they add up. And that is why, for instance, Syria, which is led by Bashar al-Assad, who is an Alawite. Alawite is a form of Shia Islam. That is why Syria has historically been at odds with a country like Saudi Arabia, which is led by Sunnis, and indeed other Arab countries that are led by Sunnis. That's why it's such a big deal that Syria and Egypt recently established diplomatic ties, a Sunni and a Shia country. That's very noteworthy. Additionally, we know that China facilitated diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia recently. Again, a big deal. Iran is a Shia nation. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni nation. So just shows you that the divide between Sunnis and Shias are very deep. Also in Iraq, after the United States deposed Saddam Hussein, the country descended into sectarian conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias. People would go, well, aren't they all Muslims? No, anyone who would say that does not understand Islam. Muslims fight one another just as white people fight one another, just as black people fight one another, just as Hindus fight one another. Everyone fights one another in the history of mankind. Sunnis and Shias are no different. That's the first thing to understand Islam, Sunni and Shia divide. A second thing, and this goes back to sort of the differences between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Unlike Christianity and Judaism, which were minority religions, believe it or not, Islam began as not a minority religion. Allow me to explain. Judaism, for the history of their entire history, have been a minority group, persecuted, and really only had their own state with the founding of Israel in 1948. Similarly, Christianity, when it was founded with Jesus in the year 0 AD, it was a minority religion, hence Jesus being crucified. And several centuries under the Roman Empire, Christians were persecuted until the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century adopted it as the religion of the Roman Empire. And sort of throughout its history, and especially at the beginning, Christianity and Judaism were minority religions. Islam was totally different. When the Prophet Muhammad established, if you will, Islam in the 7th century, he lived in Mecca. He went over to Medina, and he became not just a religious leader, but a head of a state. He conquered Medina, established a rule as head of the government and head of the religion. Then he went back to Mecca, conquered Mecca. So from the beginning, Islam did incredibly well. From there, within 1 century of the advent of Islam, it moved beyond the Arabian Peninsula. It overthrew the Persian Empire. It, meaning, of course, Islam can't overthrow something. People who were Muslim did this, various ethnic groups, overthrew the Persian Empire, invaded Central Asia, India, the Christian provinces of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Can you believe that? My God, that is unbelievable success. So immediately from the start of Islam, it was tied up, spreading their religion was tied up with statehood. And this brings us to the present day. This is part of the reason why there are few, if any, secular governments in the Muslim Middle East. Turkey and Lebanon have sort of been exceptions, but really not so much anymore. It is because, again, since the advent of Islam, statehood and religion were tied. The Prophet Muhammad was head of state, head of the religion. Also, as I said, the Quran and Sharia law are not just religious texts. They legislate about civil, constitutional matters, marriage, inheritance, proper relations, etc. Actually, Judaism, the Old Testament, is sort of set up as a theocracy in that way, where it's not just a religious text, but sort of legislates about other matters. It was really Christianity that sort of established this difference between church and state, where Jesus is believed to have said, let matters pertaining to Caesar be unto Caesar, and matters pertaining to me, Jesus, or the Lord or God, be unto the Lord, me, and God, i.e. there was separation between church and state. Also, as I said, this idea of the Caliphate is extremely important in Islam, that the Muslim world be unified, not really divided into countries, but it's one religion, one sort of movement. That's the whole basis of the Caliphate, which over time, the Caliphate went away because people started establishing their own states, and head of those states sort of replaced the Caliph. There's this guy named Sharif Hussein. He lived during the early 1900s, and he really was sort of the progenitor of this statehood movement. He wanted to overthrow the Turkish-ruled Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was Muslim, but it was led by Turks. And Islam, as any other religion, is divided into various ethnic groups: Turks, Arabs, Persians, Moors, Mongols, etc. And so Sharif Hussein wanted to overthrow the Turkish Ottoman Empire. He didn't really need a lot of help because the Ottoman Empire lost World War I and was effectively ended in 1918. But he thought that the Muslim world should be divided into different states, and he created the Pan-Arab flag, which is black, green, white with a red triangle, which this flag represents different caliphs. Interestingly, this Pan-Arab flag is also the flag of Jordan, because Sharif Hussein's son ruled Jordan and his descendants continue to rule Jordan. It is also the flag of Palestine. And you can see with these flags, there it is up on the screen, that these countries support nationhood within Islam. Not really so much a caliph. I mean, though, of course, the leaders of those countries think of themselves as the caliph, but they support this pan-Arab nationhood. But then, if you look at the Hezbollah flag, if you look at the flag of ISIS, even if you look at the flag of Saudi Arabia, you do not see any of those pan-Arab colors. You don't see black, white, green, or red. Actually, that's a correction. You do see green in the Saudi Arabia flag specifically, because the green apparently was the favorite color of Muhammad, the prophet. So that's why you see minarets, which are the towers in the mosques, often light up in green. But still, you can tell a lot about these countries from their flags. The ISIS flag, for instance, you see right here, is black, and it has Allahu Akbar, which means Allah is great, and then the creed, which I recited to you a few moments ago on the flag, and it shows that ISIS doesn't believe in this pan-Arab nationhood movement where Muslim states are divided into nations. The leaders of ISIS think that there should be one Islamic jurisdiction, one caliph that encompasses all of the different borders and countries that have come today. And so understanding the Muslim view of statehood as inextricably tied with religion, and understanding the movements of certain groups to unify the Muslim world under a caliph is so important, because it shows, really, it kind of explains why we have seen radicalism rise over the past few decades. What I'm about to say is certainly, dear God, not condoning the rise of radicalism. I am merely trying to explain it to you. Muslims view their history as being incredibly successful and then incredibly humiliating. Islam immediately was, as I said, extraordinarily successful, took over the Christian parts of Europe in the Middle East within just 1 century, and for several centuries ruled much of Europe and the Middle East. In 1453, they conquered the Byzantine Empire, the great empire of Europe. It was such a source of pride for Muslims for decades that they were bringing faith to infidels, to unbelievers. And then the tide really turned, starting in about the 1500s, 1600s, where during the Crusades, the Christian leaders started to reconquer and reclaim their lost lands, and Muslims diminished in power. In 1918, as I said, the great vast Ottoman Empire collapsed. Each nation states that comprised the Ottoman Empire were divided between the British and the French and other Western colonial powers. And in 1948, the State of Israel was founded, which is a big source of shame for Muslims. And actually, they call it that event in 1948 Nakba, which means catastrophe. So, there are a lot of sayings attributed to leaders like Osama bin Laden, who said that the recent history of Islam is, quote, humiliating. It was so successful, they conquered the West, they conquered Christians, and then the Christians came roaring back and conquered them. And so, again, not condoning it, but trying to explain that the reason why there's so much radicalism is from this deeply held view that there's been a humiliating loss of power. In addition, there are some reasons why there has been this loss of power. It's fascinating to consider why Muslims or the Muslim world was so successful and then the West really came roaring back and conquered it. I'll have to probably do a Islam part 3 because I'm realizing there's a lot to explain here, but I'll give you sort of the cliff notes. There are cultural reasons, there are economic reasons, and starting with cultural, it's a really, really tricky subject to deal with because, of course, not every Muslim is radical. Of course, not every Muslim adheres to the more sort of radical parts of the Quran. But there is more of a textual basis for oppression and radicalism in the Quran than there is in the Old or New Testament. Not to say there aren't shady, bad, oppressive parts of the Old or New Testament, but there's more of a basis in the Quran. If you look at the way the Quran talks about women, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man. That's Quran chapter 2, verse 282. Laws regarding inheritance say that brothers should get twice the share as sisters. That's Quran chapter 4, verse 176. There are wife-beating verses in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 34. Also, Muslim women may not marry a non-Muslim according to Sharia law. Muslim men may marry a non-Muslim. Muslim men can have 4 wives. Muslim women can only have 1 husband. A man can divorce his wife by simple repudiation according to Sharia law. A wife cannot divorce her husband, but can appeal to a judge to order that her husband divorce her. So there are sort of these internal things that create the basis for radicalism, not for every Muslim, but for certain sects of it. The Prophet Muhammad also had several wives. One was 9 years old. That's why the age of permissible marriage among women in Iran is 9 years old. There are all these hadiths and sayings in the Quran attributed to war, and one is a hadith: he who dies without having taken part in a campaign dies in a kind of unbelief. Another is a day and a week at warfare are better than a month of fasting and prayer. Again, there's just sort of more in there than compared to religions that have prevailed in the West that give a basis for some of the radicalism. It's just true. Also, economically, interest is forbidden in Islam. Earning interest is what I mean by that. So that sort of slowed the Muslim world down economically. The Muslim world also was divided into neighborhoods and guild systems, which is really good for community building, but not very good for economic development, meaning all of the shoemakers, all of the bakers are confined into their own neighborhoods, and they kind of have the same prices and the same services. Whereas in the West, there's more of this economic competition. Again, the neighborhood guild system, great for community building, but not really great for economic development. Finally, what I'll tell you, and I'll do a part 3 and maybe even a part 4 or a part 100 if I keep at this. Oil has been a blessing and a curse for the Muslim world. Oil has been a blessing because it has given them a lot of money, but it has been a curse because it has disincentivized economic development, because a lot of Muslim countries do make a lot of money off of oil, so they don't really need to focus on other sectors of the economy. Also, oil has enriched some fringe groups in Islam that sort of would have been phased out had they not been given this money. One of the examples is the Wahhabis, which is a sect of Sunni Islam, which rule alongside the Saud dynasty in Saudi Arabia. The reason why they have been able to stay in power and exert influence, and they are a radical group, the Wahhabis, is because Saudi Arabia is very wealthy in oil. I'll close with one statistic. A group of Arab intellectuals in the UN showed that the exports of the entire Arab world, other than oil, amount to less of those of the country of Finland alone. So complicated, so interesting. I will talk to you more about Islam in subsequent episodes. And just remember in the meantime that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. Thank you very much for joining us today, and see you soon.